Well, at this point, I'd like to welcome in Devin into our webinar. Like I said, he's one of our top-notch Old Testament PhD students here at Southeastern, and I really look forward to hearing your paper, Devin.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. All righty, thank you everyone for coming. Let me get my PowerPoint pulled up here. All right, so as Chrissy said, the title of this paper is Who's for Dinner? New Arguments for the Minority View of the Metaphor in Micah 3, verses 2 through 3. So let's begin. Introduction. When the book of Micah asks the question, who is like Yahweh, as given in Micah's name, Micha, one could aptly respond, not the leaders of Judah. Throughout the book, the prophet uses strong metaphors to indict Judah's leaders who have steeped the city with injustice. We see this occurring in chapters 2, 3, 6, and 7. Micah 3, verses 2 through 3, uses a particularly grisly and novel metaphor that imagines the leaders flaying skin, breaking bones, chopping flesh, and eating. In the history of interpretation, scholars have offered a variety of understandings for the passage's imagery. Some have viewed this language as an image of wild animals eating, while others as images of Assyrian torture. But most scholars believe the metaphor actually depicts cannibalism. Prominent scholars like Francis Anderson, David Friedman, and Bruce Waltke all favor the idea that Micah's oracle compares the economic oppression by Israel's leaders to cannibals who flay and eat people. This view has gained a majority following and has dominated the discussion of Micah 3 in scholarship. And given its dominance, it would appear that the issue has been settled for some time. Yet, it's important to ask whether the majority understanding offers the best understanding of the imagery in Micah 3. I argue here that it does not. And instead, I promote a minority view that the metaphor imagines the leaders as butchers, not cannibals. Micah 3, verses 2 through 3, combines the common Hebrew conceptual metaphors, eating is destruction, and humans are animals, to create the novel conceptual metaphor, economic oppression is butchery. After an overview of the history of interpretation, I will review the arguments for the various understandings of the metaphor's imagery, provide support for the metaphor, economic oppression is butchery, and conclude with a very brief overview of the metaphor's meaning. So first, a bit of theory. What is a metaphor? To study metaphor, many scholars of the Old Testament have adopted George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's conceptual metaphor theory. When Lakoff and Johnson introduced conceptual metaphor theory, they redefined metaphor as, quote, a cross-domain mapping in the conceptual system, end quote. Metaphor is understanding one conceptual domain, a target domain, in terms of another conceptual domain, a source domain. In other words, metaphors are not merely linguistic expressions. Metaphors reside in human thought and reasoning. These metaphors typically arise through our physical interactions with the world and allow us, for example, to understand and experience abstract concepts like love and arguments in terms of concrete concepts like journeys and war. Now, so Lakoff and Johnson, just a little bit of information, use uppercase to distinguish between a conceptual metaphor, like love is a journey, that occurs in our mind, from the particular metaphorical expressions under that concept that manifest in our language, like the phrase, look how far we've come. So argument is war is a conceptual metaphor to describe the metaphorical expressions that are happening in your claims are indefensible, and he attacked every weak point in my argument. So using language from mathematics, they argue each conceptual metaphor has a set of mappings, which is a set of correspondences between constituent elements in a source domain, like travelers and vehicles in a journey in the journey domain, and the constituent elements in a target domain, like lovers and a love relationship in the love domain. And you can see the rest of these mappings below. And here, the source and target are reversed in order to indicate that understanding moves from concrete to abstract. And so with this method, one can discuss Micah 3, verses 2 through 3 in depth. Micah 3, verses 2 through 3 uses a novel conceptual metaphor to construe the prior condemnations in chapter 2, which describes Israel's leaders economically oppressing their citizens in order to increase their own welfare. They steal property from men, women, and children, according to verses 2 and 9 in chapter 2. And they seize and retain a debtor's pledge cloak, according to 2 verse 8, in violation of Exodus 22:26. Semantic and syntactic parallels unite chapters 2 and 3, so that Micah 3 addresses the target domain of economic oppression in chapter 2 with a vivid and novel metaphor in chapter 3, highlighted with italics here. And so I'll read. And I said, please listen, heads of Jacob, and rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice? You who hate good and love evil, who rip their skin off of them and their flesh off their bones, who eat their flesh of my people and strip their skin off of them and break their bones and chop them like flesh in a pot and like meat in a cooking pot. It's very grisly. So let's talk about the history of interpretation. The history of interpretation for this passage shows a variety of understandings for the language here. Prior to 1970, many believed the metaphor construed the leaders as wild animals. For example, Jerome wrote that the metaphor describes the leader's cruelty like a lion or a robber. Cyril of Alexandria likened the leaders to cruel beasts. John Calvin believed the metaphor depicted the leaders as wolves eating beef or mutton. Matthew Henry viewed the leaders as beasts of prey that eat the flock in contrast with shepherds who cared for it. Finally, J.M. Smith Powys commented that the metaphor imagines the people as a defenseless flock and the leaders as wild beasts and ravening wolves. Viewing the leaders as wild animals provides a source domain that creates the conceptual metaphor, economic oppression is wild animals eating. This understanding aligns Micah with many other passages in the Old Testament that liken Israel's enemies to wild animals, like Psalm 22. But around 1970, scholars mostly abandoned the image of leaders as wild animals. Instead, the majority of commentators now argue that the metaphor construes the leaders as cannibals. And surprisingly, if you were to go on Google and Google cannibalism, there's a lot of very gruesome images. So we'll settle for our image here with one of the most beloved cannibalistic tales, Hansel and Gretel. So back to Micah. Commenting about Micah, Julia O'Brien, for example, writes that Micah's description of injustice as cannibalism extends ad nauseum. And contrary to prior interpretations, the eaters and the eaten are humans, not animals, as Jerome and John Calvin had argued. This view introduced a new feeling of gruesomeness and immorality to the metaphor. And the conceptual metaphor, economic oppression is cannibalism, it has become the dominant way scholars have understood these verses. One can see this interpretation appearing in major commentaries and filtering down into English study Bibles like the ESV, CSB, and NIV. I'll just give you a moment to see the major commentaries here and the major authors who all agree that the metaphor is about cannibals eating, not animals. So, among the wave of scholarship like this who identify the metaphor's source domain as cannibalism, a few scholars have also suggested that the metaphor may imply a second source domain. Stephen Dempster proposes that some of this metaphor could depict Assyrian torture. He writes, the prophet may also be alluding to the Assyrian practice of flaying captured enemies as a means of inspiring terror and discouraging resistance. Perhaps if there is an allusion to this practice, Micah is clarifying the identity of the real enemy. Similarly, Joanna Hoyt argues the imagery serves a dual purpose by allowing a figurative and a literal expression. The figurative would be the cannibalistic metaphor, and the literal expression would resemble the actions of the Assyrians, who, quote, would soon triumph over the northern kingdom. Dempster and Hoyt are referring to the Assyrian torture of flaying and dismembering as depicted in Assyrian art. So we have one image of Assyrian art, which has the Assyrians flaying their prisoners alive and carrying away the heads of the slain. And we also have another image here of Assyrians flaying their prisoners. And this is also described in the records of Assyrian kings Ashurnasirpal II, Sargon II, and Ashurbanipal. And here from one campaign we can read, "They hung their corpses from stakes, flayed their skins, and covered with them the walls of the town." So if Dempster and Hoyt are correct, the conceptual metaphor would be a combination of economic oppression is cannibalism and economic oppression is Assyrian torture. Given the dominance in scholarship of the cannibalism source domain for this metaphor, it would appear the issue has been settled for some time. However, an alternative to the prior choices exists. Instead of wolves who eat sheep, cannibals who eat people, or enemies who torture, some have viewed the leaders as butchers who slaughter an animal. Elizabeth Achtemeyer, for example, labels the leaders as, quote, legal butchers, and writes that they were, quote, treating the people like a butcher slaughtering an animal, end quote. Similarly, Thomas Mitkomitsky writes that Micah, quote, pictures the civil leaders as treating the exploited class like animals being butchered and prepared for eating, end quote. Instead of cannibalism, the source domain would be butchery, providing the conceptual metaphor, economic oppression is butchery. And although a few scholars dispersed throughout the history of interpretation have offered this possibility, this view has not gained significant traction and has not appeared in major commentary series that have occurred in the last several years. Economic oppression is cannibalism still dominates the discussion. So issues. A few issues lie within the history of interpretation in Micah 3 verses 2 through 3. First, scholars do not explain why one should choose a certain view of the metaphor source domain over another. In most cases, scholars assume a metaphor's explanation is self-evident. Only John Mackay interacts with the various possibilities when he states that the metaphor is neither about cannibalism nor wild animals. He writes, "The picture then, in the rest of 3:2 and in 3:3 is a brutal one. It goes beyond comparisons made of elsewhere of evil rulers to wild animals, as in Ezekiel 22:27 and Zephaniah 3:3. Some have likened it to cannibalism. Certainly, the language is that of butchering an animal whose skin is stripped from it and the meat separated from the bones." However, John Mackay does not give any reasoning or evidence for this choice. He merely states it. Second, some authors have created confusion by combining multiple contradictory domains for the metaphor source domain. For example, Kenneth Barker and Waylon Bailey write that the passage uses a metaphor of cannibalism, just as we've stated already. Yet, they also write, in quote, "Instead of shepherding them, the civil leaders are pictured," keyword, they are pictured as exploiting and oppressing them like animals that are being butchered, cooked, and prepared for eating. Likewise, although Peter Jensen says that there are cannibalistic overtones in the passage, he labels the source domain for Israel's leaders as wild animals preying on sheep or other defenseless animals. However, and this is a key point, the leaders cannot be cannibals if the passage pictures the people as cattle. Say that again. The leaders cannot be pictured as cannibals if the passage also pictures the people as cattle. One must choose a single, consistent source domain for the language. So this variety of understandings of the source domain in Micah 3 and the issues we've just described within these understandings mean it will prove fruitful to offer a fresh assessment of Micah 3 verses 2 through 3. So let's talk about weaknesses of the prevailing views. Of the four metaphorical options, two unlikely conceptual metaphors at work are economic oppression is wild animals eating and economic oppression is Assyrian torture. Although the Assyrians committed grisly torture, as we have already seen and heard, their records do not suggest they stripped human flesh off the bone or ate their victims. Therefore, this domain cannot account for the entire image in verses 2 through 3. Likewise, although the Hebrew Bible regularly compares the wicked to wild animals, as we've already stated in Psalm 22, happens again in Ezekiel 22 and Zephaniah 3. So although the Hebrew Bible regularly compares the wicked to wild animals, Micah's metaphor depicts the leaders acting methodically with the language of from butchery and cooking. Instead of tearing Tarath prey as a beast would, the leaders strip off pashat, the skin, portraying the action with the same word as Leviticus 1:6, when the priest removes the animal's hide for the whole burnt offering. Likewise, while there are plenty of passages that depict animals breaking bones of their prey, like Isaiah 38 and Daniel 6, bones also appear in the context of cooking in Ezekiel 24, verses 4 through 5 and 10, and Isaiah 25, verses 6 through 8. And stews were a common dish in ancient Israel and were the most economical meat dish. And bones would have been valuable for their marrow they would have added. And so because Micah 3, verse 3 mentions the usage of pots, it is likely that the breaking of bones here is not an animal breaking bones, but it imagines either A, the breaking of bones for consumption of the marrow after boiling the bones in a stew, or breaking their bones beforehand in preparation for cooking in a stew in order to flavor it with the marrow. So they're benefiting from the breaking of bones. The timing is unclear whether it's before or after cooking it. Finally, the mention of pots and chopping meat places the imagery firmly in the domain of cooking. The leaders are portrayed as cutting meat into smaller pieces in order to boil them. Micah's metaphor then depicts the entire process of butchery in a poetic way, which invalidates the view that the metaphor depicts a wild animal eating. The conceptual metaphor, economic oppression is cannibalism, does present a viable option though. Cannibalism could proceed through the normal means of food preparation, which justifies the butchery images. And because the biblical material evaluates cannibalism as immoral, the source domain of cannibalism allows one to map this characteristic to the target, providing a moral evaluation of the wicked leader's actions. When one projects these two domains onto Micah 3, the following mappings occur. So here the cannibal would be mapped to the leaders, human being to people, a knife to their commands and judicial rulings, and so on and so forth. And at the bottom, we see the immorality of cannibalism would be mapped to the immorality of oppression. And it's this final mapping of immorality that has been a primary focus of scholarly discussion. Cannibalism, it is argued, is, quote, a savage figurative description that adequately describes these wicked leaders, end quote. Because cannibalism ensued from times of dire distress, Micah portrays these high officials as committing one of the, quote, most gruesome and repellent actions that any human could do to another, end quote, in order to capture how abhorrently they have acted. Francis Anderson and David Friedman note the cruelty of this imagery when they write, quote, cannibalism under duress and extremis is one thing. To eat a human out of sheer malevolence is another, end quote. This gruesome imagery would also awaken the sensibilities of Micah's readers. As Dempster writes, quote, the strategy of the prophet is to shock and evoke revulsion, end quote. And so this imagery of cannibalism would affirm the indictment that Micah's oracle is giving, according to these interpretations. So, but like the prior two metaphorical concepts, however, there are weaknesses that exist with this choice. First, economic oppression is cannibalism does not best explain why it is significant that the leaders remove the skin from the people, an image that the passage mentions twice. Some commentators seem to have struggled with the purpose of this imagery. For example, Bruce Waltke says, all that is left of their victims is unpalatable skin and bones. Likewise, Delbert Hillers seems to unconsciously drift from the cannibalism metaphor when he describes the leaders as, quote, tearing off the hide as inedible but of value, end quote. However, if the metaphor depicts cannibalism, then the term hide is inappropriate because that would be used appropriately for an animal. And it's unclear what the value of human skin would be if the person is a cannibal, because the passage mentions it twice. So there must be some value there. A second weakness. The only evidence that supports cannibalism as the metaphor is a literal reading of the word people in 3 verse 2. The leaders are cannibals, it is argued, because the text says they are eating the flesh of God's people. This logic, however, forgets the metaphorical context. A native English speaker, for example, would be rightly confused if asked to explain the cannibalism imagery in the following sentences. He will chew you up and spit you out. You're so cute, I could just eat you up. And the defense has swallowed him up. None of these sentences imagines cannibalism. Rather, they use the conceptual metaphor, humans are food. Similarly, the book of Micah could be construing the people as animals butchered for food without explicitly referring to them as an animal. Psalm 30:14, for example, describes those who have teeth and fangs that they use to devour the poor. There are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives, to devour the poor from the earth, the needy from mankind. And we can see a parallel passage which shows that this is about an actual lion. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of men, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. The passage's language in Psalm 30:14 portrays the leaders as lions without explicitly calling them such. And the same could be happening in Micah. So the conceptual metaphor, humans are animals, is also a common conceptual metaphor in the Hebrew Bible. God's people are often a domestic animal, while their enemies are wild animals. For example, in Jeremiah 50:17, Israel is a scattered lamb, while the kings of Assyria and Babylon are lions. The Hebrew Bible also regularly metaphorizes God's people as an animal being eaten to convey the destruction others have inflicted. And we see this occurring in the same passage when it says he devoured them and gnawed his bones. The presence of these metaphors in the Hebrew Bible means that it's not absolutely necessary to view the metaphor in Micah 3, verses 2 through 3, as depicting cannibalism simply because it mentions eating, quote, people. So, what about arguments for the minority view? Because of the problems with viewing the leaders as wild animals, as Assyrians, and as cannibals, it is better to view the metaphor as construing the leaders as butchers and their people as animals. The overarching conceptual metaphor would be economic oppression is butchery, which contains the conceptual metaphors rulers are butchers, humans are animals/food, and which builds upon the conventional conceptual metaphor, eating is destruction. Contextual evidence first confirms this suggestion. The proceeding pastoral imagery in Micah 2, verses 12 through 13, which occurs immediately prior to this article, it activates the conceptual metaphor, humans are animals in the reader's mind and should influence how one reads Micah 3, verses 2 through 3. The two passages are linked, as you can see, by references to Jacob and Israel in 2 verse 12 and 3:1, and by the contrast of Yahweh, who is at their head with the heads of Jacob. More importantly, these verses call God's people a sheep and a flock explicitly right before our passage. These humans are animals metaphor also appears as a theme in the rest of Micah, making it more likely that the same metaphor is occurring in Micah 3, verses 2 through 3. It appears implicitly in Micah 5:3, when God promises a shepherd who will feed Israel. It also appears in Micah 7:14, when God calls Israel the Lord's flock and promises they will graze. And notice here what's really interesting. The command in this passage in 7:14 to shepherd your people also contrasts with the actions of the leaders who eat the flesh of my people in the prior chapter in 3:3. So, economic oppression is butchery, um, is activated with humans or animals in the prior and succeeding passages. Next, economic oppression is butchery also provides better explanatory power for the metaphor. With the humans or animals conceptual metaphor, the repeated image of stripping skin retains proper value. Micah imagines the Judean leaders stripping the valuable hide, the homes and property from the people for their own benefits. Thus, economic oppression is butchery, avoids interpreting the language too literally. It accounts for the context of Micah. It aligns the text with common conceptual metaphors in the Hebrew Bible, and it provides a better understanding of the butchery language used and the proper value of tearing off something's skin. What makes the accusation in Micah 3 so shocking is not that the leaders are cannibals, but that the leaders have acted as butchers who feed themselves on Yahweh's people, whom they should have protected. Instead of treating them as people, they have treated them as a consumable commodity for their own pleasure and gain. The new metaphor exhibits the following mappings. We can see a butcher would now parallel the leaders, animals to people, the knife to the commands and judicial rulings. And so the last half is similar to many things in cannibal, but the prior half is what is different. So the observant reader will notice that the mappings for economic oppression is butchery does not include immorality at the bottom as a constituent element for the source and target domains. Because butchery is not inherently immoral, this mapping does not exist in the source. And metaphors only map structure from the source domain to the target domain, not vice versa. However, it is not necessary for the source domain to have the characteristic of immorality simply because the target domain is an immoral act. Psalm 14:4 illustrates this point well. The psalmist says that evildoers consume my people as they consume bread. The eating domain effectively construes the destructive and immoral nature of their actions despite its amoral status. So eating bread is an amoral action, but destroying God's people is a negative one. So you can see an amoral source domain construing a negative domain. So Micah's image still evokes a sense of violence and harm, though. One rightly grimaces at hearing how leaders have flayed and chopped their citizens. One may ask then, how can the metaphor evoke these feelings if butchering animals is not inherently a violent or immoral act? So while several options exist, Zoltan Kovacs demonstrates that we interpret the characteristics of some metaphors by contrasting two concepts. In the case of Micah, the passage first presents two conceptual categories, butchery and economic oppression, which have a metaphorical relationship because both concern the division of a previously whole entity. When we read Micah's metaphor, we intuitively compare a butcher's actions with the just, good, and caring actions of a good leader. A good leader will love what is good and know justice, as Micah 3 verses 1-2 describes. So instead of interpreting the butchery domain independently, we understand the act of butchery to be violent and harmful because it contrasts with what a leader ought to do, preserve and care for the people. It's also possible that the passage intends to contrast the butchery domain with the shepherd domain. As already mentioned, the rulers are shepherds conceptual metaphor appears several times in Micah. So the passage may intend to contrast the butcher's actions with the actions of a good shepherd, just as it happens in Ezekiel 34. So whatever the passage's intention, though, the passage's focus is to metaphorically imagine how the leaders have stolen property from people and the resulting harm of those actions to accuse and indict Judah's leaders. Conclusion. The history of interpretation presented 4 source domains to consider for Micah's metaphor. Judah's economic oppression has been imagined as wild animals eating, Syrian torture, cannibalism, and butchery. The first 3 could not account for the whole metaphor or the context of the pastoral imagery. Instead, Micah uses the conceptual metaphor, economic oppression is butchery. He deliberately uses 2 common Hebrew conceptual metaphors, eating is destruction and humans are animals, in order to create a novel, extended metaphor that structures the violent and harmful crimes of Judah's leaders. It describes the leaders flaying skin and flesh to describe the separation of people from possession and their property. And this intimately unites property and person to highlight the value of the objects being taken and to highlight the resulting harm caused by taking them. It describes the leaders breaking bones as a figurative expression for how the leaders have caused grief and pain to the citizens through their crimes. It describes the leaders chopping meat in a pot for future consumption to imagine how the leaders have divided families and properties for their own gain. Finally, it imagines the leaders eating meat to construe how they have destroyed others and benefited by their actions. These metaphors highlight how the leaders have acted with purpose and methodically. And this purpose is also captured in chapter 2, verse 1. The images also capitalize on the bloody practice of butchery to convey the harm which the leaders have committed. The hands of these oppressive leaders are covered in blood, as chapter 3, verse 10 says. And the metaphors highlight the weakness and innocence of the people of Israel, who were like a defenseless and weak domestic animal. Through these metaphors, Micah effectively charges leaders with evil crimes and calls the reader to see their impending judgment as just, as chapter 3, verse 4 will say. Thank you.